My name's Stephen Michelle. Welcome to another Red into Black webinar session. And today we're lucky enough to have a discussion about a very topical issue, which is the director IDs, why we need them, how to apply. And we've got a couple of experts that are joining us today. So we've got Rob Hayes, who's the Director of ID Onboarding at the Australian Business Registry Services, and Martin Jacobs, who is the Assistant Commissioner at the Australian Business Registry Services. And also in the background, we've got Kayla Caruso, who is assisting actually with the presentation today. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. If you want to ask questions, please feel free to do so. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat function and a Q&A function. Please feel free to use those. But at the end of the presentation, that's when we'll be answering any questions that might be there. So feel free to use that as we go through. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And I think I'll just hand over to you to start the presentation off.
Right, Stephen, thank you. And thank you very much to people joining for today. Robin Hayes and I are going to go and work through some materials that will help answer the questions that have been set up. And then we're obviously going to be here at the end to answer any detailed questions that you have. But as Stephen said, the key point at the moment is Director ID is quite topical in terms of where we're up to with the rollout of director identification numbers. So we'll go into a bit of detail about what does it mean to get a director identification number, how do you do the process, and how are we going in terms of onboarding people. But the critical thing at the moment is we're at this period where there's a looming deadline, which is existing directors need to come forward and get a director ID by the 30th of November 2022. So that time frame is obviously coming up very close, very soon. The other bit that you may have experienced now is that we're actually in a period where we're actually doing a public awareness campaign and providing some guidance materials out there. So that public campaign was launched about a week ago, and it's starting to get some good traction, and we're starting to see the numbers tick up in terms of directors coming on board to get their director ID. But we'll go through a bit of that in detail. The other bit I wanted to talk about was reminding people about why we're doing director identification numbers, because I think it's easier for people to understand why there's a new obligation to come and do something if they understand, well, what's the purpose behind it. I think for this audience, it's really critical to understand that Director ID has been put in place to help improve the visibility and the verification of the identity of directors. And so pretty critical role in terms of what directors do in companies, and the role of companies in the Australian economy is very significant. So having visibility over the identities of directors is really a critical point. And so for regulators and for other business users who want to have confidence in the identity of people that sit behind companies, having a verification process for those directors is really important. And we wanted to go through and also tell you a bit about how we're starting to use Director ID to help make a difference. So I think people in the audience will know about illegal phoenixing and the sort of negative impacts that has. We really want to show you how we're starting to use Director ID to help make impacts on that. So I might just go to the next slide. And so Robin and Kayla and I are all from what's called the Australian Business Registry Services. It's part of the Australian Taxation Office. It was set up to look after business registry services, and it sort of combines the Australian Business Register, which people will know doing ABN registrations, along with company registrations. So registrations that are registrations with ASIC, that service moved to the Australian Taxation Office last year and is being run out of the Australian Taxation Office through the Australian Business Register. So it's starting to bring together company registrations and ABN registration into one area. There's another program of work that's called Modernising Business Registers, and that's actually going to look to modernise those business register services. The whole company register and the way that you interact with the company's register is going to change. The first service that we've actually launched out of that is actually Director ID. So when people are interacting with Director ID, they're actually interacting with a new platform that we're starting to build out that will be this modernised business register. But Director ID is the first the first part of that, and the company's release will take that and basically put director IDs against companies. And so we can talk through about the timing of that a bit later as well in terms of phasing. I might just move to the next slide. So you're obviously here because you've got an interest in director ID. It's really useful to just make sure we understand what we mean when we say a director ID. And so this is a new legal obligation for directors to come and get a director ID. Really importantly, they only need to do it once. So directors only have to go through this process once. It's free to do. We've put a service up that basically enables people to get it. We'll talk through that service. Primarily, it's a digital service, so people can do this online, but we do recognise that not everyone may meet the requirements to be able to access that digital service, and so therefore may need other assistance, and we'll go through that. But director identification numbers, so in the end, what you get is, out of doing this, you go through a process to verify your identity, and you're given a 15-digit number, which is used to then track a director's relationships with companies over time. And when we look at what the purpose of this is intending to do, it helps have a confidence that a person who identifies themselves as director and has been director of a number of companies over time, that same person can be seen as having that relationship with those companies. It certainly is starting to prevent the use of fictitious identities. So you can't get through this process if you try to use a fictitious identity, and we can give some examples of where we've held up those director IDs and not issued them, because in effect the underlying person is not the person who's representing themselves, and so that's actually starting to drive that value. Straw directors, people can still nominate directors, and those directors need to come in, but the value of this is when a director is appointed, we know who that director is, and if that director is appointed to multiple companies, then we know that that relationship over time exists, and that certainly will help regulators look for instances of illegal behaviour that's exhibited across multiple companies. The director ID is then given to the person who has verified their identity with the registrar. In terms of who needs a director ID, so the law talks about eligible officers, and so eligible officers for the purpose of director ID includes directors or alternate directors. It doesn't include things like other company office holders, secretaries, external administrators, or anyone. It's really focused in on those people who hold a directorship with a company. So then the critical thing becomes timing. And so director ID has actually been in existence since 1st of November last year. So newly appointed directors from the 1st of November last year have actually had an obligation to come and get a director ID. And we've seen quite good take up from new directors. We can also talk about the fact that we are actually following up directors who have not got a director ID. When it first commenced from November, there was a period there where directors had 28 days in which to get a director ID. But from the 5th of April, directors are required to get a director ID prior to appointment. And we are seeing that happen. We are seeing quite good rates of directors getting their director ID prior to being appointed. And where directors have not got a director ID, we are following up those directors to make them aware of their obligation to get a director ID. There's sort of two acts under which director ID operates. It's the first one is the Corporations Act that everyone will know. The other one is there's the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Act. And so for directors who are appointed to a company that's administered under the Corporations Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act, they do have a different time frame in which to get a director ID. So if you're a director of one of those corporations, you're actually going to have the transitional arrangements for those directors actually extend out to 30 November 2023. Having said that, we are sort of at this point in time sort of encouraging directors to come forward and get a director ID. So there's no reason that those directors can't apply now to get a director ID. But they do have the availability to have that additional time, and we're certainly looking at the arrangements that we have in place to communicate with those directors to make it clear about the obligations that they have, but also to help support them to get their director ID. I did talk a bit about being really clear about, well, why are we introducing this obligation on all directors to come forward and get a director ID? And I think there's pretty good awareness of the costs that illegal Phoenix activity has on the economy. And really, when you look at those costs, I mean, obviously there's costs in terms of there's unpaid obligations that might be there for things like the tax office or state revenue administrators, or other sort of government agencies. But critically also, it's the impact that it has on other businesses. So there are businesses who supply to businesses that do illegal Phoenix activity, where the business has done this work for them and basically doesn't get paid for them. And there's obviously severe impacts for those employees or contractors who work for that business who miss out on entitlements. And so there's a real worry that the costs of illegal Phoenixing, could look to grow, and Director ID is seen as a critical means of helping prevent illegal Phoenix activity, because what it does is it enables regulators and others eventually to look at the information about who's sitting behind a company and see that a particular person may be involved in serial companies that have basically gone into liquidation and have had unpaid debts, and because of their activities, there's action that should be taken against the directors. So it makes it really much harder to hide from the consequences of being involved in illegal activity. I think on the next one, so I think this one here, and I'll pause on it just for a minute, is an example that's in the public domain about false director appointments, and really looking at where you can have instances of people being appointed as directors that are really false identities, and the consequences that has. And so this is a critical point for us about being able to follow up on those behaviours, but also to prevent the use of fictitious identities. And so when we go through what's the requirements for the registrar to be satisfied about the identity of a director, and some could say that those look pretty onerous in terms of the sort of number of things that you need to do to show, to prove your identity. The reason those requirements are in place is to help support the fact that we're putting this in place to basically not allow fictitious identities to be appointed as directors. So we will have confidence that the person who's applying for a director ID, who subsequently gets appointed to a director role, we have confidence that person is who they say they are. And it's through that identity verification checking up front with the issuing of director ID that gives us that confidence in those. So if the director ID requirements had been in place, in this example, the person whose details were stolen would have been required to personally apply for their director ID and have their identity verified prior to appointment. So the other protection that's in place with this is if somebody seeks to appoint somebody as a director and that person doesn't have a director ID, we're now following up on those new appointments. So I said that from 1 November last year, directors have an obligation to come and get director ID. We're taking that director appointment data and we're actually contacting directors. And so where we identify a director doesn't have a director ID, we make contact with them. That's starting to identify instances where people are seeking to appoint people. And I think it might be understood about that concept of non-consenting directors. So we've seen instances where people have sought to appoint somebody as director and that person hasn't consented to be a director. The other one is where somebody's taken some details of somebody else and then look to use those details to appoint them as a director. And so the director ID process will bring that to light, and we'll look to follow that person up. And if that person did not agree to be a director, then it gives us that instance of identifying people who are trying to appoint false directors in there. Let's go to the next slide. I might hand to Rob, who's going to talk through the process for directors to apply, but very happy at the end to come back and answer any questions about the purpose and intent of director ID. And Rob, I was happy if you wanted to share the good news about the numbers that we've got as well.
Yeah, for sure, Martin. Thank you very much. And we will get to our progress in regard to onboarding directors in the fullness of the presentation. Did want to talk about how to apply for a director identification number. More than 88% of the directors who have successfully applied and obtained their director identification number to date have done so online using the ADRS online service, which leverages the MyGov ID smartphone app. Now, many of you may well be familiar with the MyGov ID service itself, but there is a key distinction between MyGov ID and MyGov. Many will be familiar also with their MyGov account, especially for those here in Victoria who have no doubt got their vaccination certificates, etc., available through their MyGov account. The MyGov account lets you link to different government online services, where the MyGov ID service itself is really an app for a smartphone or a smart device, and it contains within it a proof of identity component to allow you to get a credential. That is very much part of the online application service, and it forms the first step one in applying for the Director ID. Next slide, thanks, Kayla. I do want to note that in regard to the MyGov ID service, while obtaining a standard strength MyGov ID will be enough to get most applicants through the Director ID application, the strong credential, there are a couple of different credentials that you can get through that MyGov ID service. The strong credential, which relies on photo technology, the photo in your passport against a selfie, for example. By using the strong credential, it actually will provide users a smoother online experience by eliminating some of the questions that applicants need to answer as a part of step 2 in this process of applying for their director identification. The MyGov ID service will, of course, for the standard strength credential, will accept a driver's license, passport, birth certificate, and the documentation outlined in this slide. And then once someone has got their MyGov ID, they go to the abrs.gov.au website and use that MyGov ID to sign in. And that is by way of a code being sent to their smart device, and they use that code to log in. Those who have obtained the standard credential MyGov ID will be presented with some questions. And this is really about the proof of ATO records, the information that the Australian Taxation Office knows about the individual. And it may well be the questions that they might prefer to answer might revolve around their latest notice of assessment, the bank account details to which tax refunds, etc., have been paid to, their superannuation account details, and that excludes self-managed super funds. These are the super account details will be more around APRA regulated super funds. Perhaps a dividend statement, a Centrelink payment summary, or a pay-as-you-go summary. As I said, the questions that are presented to the applicant, if they have that strong MyGov ID credential, this particular step will be bypassed. Once the applicant has answered their questions and completed the relevant declarations and completed the Director ID application itself, which is about confirming some of those details and their email address, etc., they will then be presented on screen with their director identification number. There are no human interventions when an applicant is applying for their director ID online. They get their ID instantly. In most cases, the process start to finish, providing that the documentation, that the applicant has got all their documentation at hand, should take no more than 10 to 12 minutes. We're encouraging directors to ensure that they not only save their director ID, but they share it with their trusted advisor, the individual who looks after their company affairs, their tax agent or their BAS agent, etc. It is a number that will be used to link those individuals to the companies to which they are a director of in the fullness of time. So it does need to be treated securely, but it is a little bit different to the tax file number. In that it can be shared around a little, but it still needs to be safely secured. There will be some decisions made in the future in regard to the availability of the number more broadly to the public. information about the director identification number at this point in time. It's not a number like the ABN or an ACN that can be searched. The details at this point in time are retained by the registrar. The registrar may well use and share that information with other law enforcement agencies, but it is by no way available to the public for their consumption or others to use. So what happens next once someone has their director ID and we're progressing to onboard people through the onboarding process, and we're continuing to develop the Modernising Business Registers program. Right now, there are no changes to any of the ASIC online services. I know that there'll be people on the line who interact with the ASIC companies register. They may well be using commercial software that's available from a number of commercial providers. They may well be using portal services. They may well be consuming services from ASIC directly through their website. There are no changes to the ASIC forms, the 201 to incorporate a company, for example. There are no changes to the Form 484 notification of changes to details of an Australian company. There are no changes to the Form 370, which is the form applicable for foreign entities. Those changes will take place in future. Will be a requirement to include the director ID and reference to director ID in the future when the ASIC companies register transitions across to the Australian Business Registry Services in a few years. You might need to check with your commercial provider in regard to director ID functionality. We certainly are aware that there are a number of commercial providers who are already making provision for the collection and storage of the director ID to make it easier in future for agents to actually access and utilise the director ID in order to link individuals to entities in the fullness of time. Right now, there's no requirement to provide the director ID to ASIC in any of the notifications or forms. It is only required by ASIC if it is specifically requested by them as a part of an investigation, for example. Thanks, Kayla. Now, much of the success of director ID to date is really on the back of some hard work by intermediaries, agents, ASIC registered agents, BAS agents, tax agents, to encourage their director clients to apply ahead of the 30 November 2022 deadline to get their director ID and be prepared. We're encouraging agents to get their clients to download the MyGov ID app and complete their director identification number application prior to the 30th of November to beat the rush. We certainly know that human behaviour dictates that people will very much leave it till the last minute. Many of this cohort will be in the small business sector who have got far greater things to worry about from the perspective of trying to keep the lights on in their shop and stock on their shelves, etc. And 30 November still seems like it's a long way off. But we certainly are encouraging agents who may be consulting their director clients in the interim to get their director ID as quickly as possible. There are a number of resources available from the abrs.gov.au website. We've recently published a how to apply step-by-step video. The purpose of that video really is to help build the bridge that agents are currently covering off at the moment. Many agents are having to spend copious amounts of time with their clients over the phone, walking them through the process. As a reminder, directors themselves are required to apply for their own director ID. It can't be done by the agent. And in many cases, our anecdotal evidence is that many agents are having to spend a lot of time guiding their clients through the process. The how to apply video does all of that work for them and shows and helps prepare applicants for their application, telling them what they need before they sit down to apply, and guides them through the process start to finish. We also have available from the ABRS website a number of information sheets that have been translated into around 10 different languages for those who, in the instance where English isn't their first, their native tongue. Thanks, Kayla. Martin mentioned a little bit earlier in the piece the broader marketing campaign, which kicked off only a week or so ago. We've included a reference to a media release from the Assistant Treasurer, which commenced that marketing campaign. If you're travelling through an airport or if you're in an area with large billboards and that type of thing, you will start to see, hopefully, some of the marketing materials, marketing imagery that has been prepared to sit alongside this marketing campaign, aimed to reach the directors themselves. We've got very, very limited channels, efficient channels to reach the directors. The aims of this marketing campaign is to actually get that awareness and visibility in front of these directors themselves. Thanks, Kayla. This slide just includes some of the creative assets that you may well see popping up in, as I said, billboards and electronic advertising. There is also a broader media campaign, which includes social media, online marketing, print, to also help support and create that level of awareness. Martin, did you want to cover off the...
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Yep. So I spoke before about the fact that we are following up directors who have been appointed since November and don't have a director ID. So the question comes, what's going to happen about the number of directors that have to get a director ID by 30 November? We expect that there'll be a number of people who go to try and complete this obligation and might take some extra time to do it. We're very much encouraging people to come and get a director ID now, but we will ultimately be following up those directors who don't get a director ID. But we do want to communicate that, we're going to take a supportive approach, which is what we did when we first launched director ID back in November last year. We've been taking a supportive approach to directors to give them time to get their director ID. And that's what we'll do after 30 November. We'll look to follow up those directors who don't have director ID and communicate with them about the obligation and provide them with awareness of how to meet that obligation. But we do reserve that the intent of director ID is to be able to take firmer action against directors, and there are instances where we might identify a director who's been involved in suspected illegal activity and therefore may want to follow through on following up that director about their director ID. So the main bit we want to communicate out is we do want people to take this time to meet their obligation, get their director ID. There's the ability for directors who require additional time to seek an extension from that time, and we're certainly very open to providing directors with additional time to get their director ID. But if directors don't get their director ID, they can expect to be followed up. There are quite firm penalties for directors that don't get a director ID. They're enforced by ASIC, and ASIC have the enforcement powers to follow up those directors. And there's the ability for the registrar of the ABRS to refer directors across to ASIC, and on that side that we've got there, that goes through the range of offences that are there and the criminal penalties that can be enforced. But in normal things where you're introducing something as a new obligation, our first thing is to help and assist people to make them aware. We see the education campaign that we've got at the moment, and that the broader communications will help us to get to audiences that people don't all see themselves as actually being in director roles. You may have heard that there are directors of corporate trustees of self-managed super funds who might not see themselves as traditionally in a director role, and so some of the marketing campaigns are targeted to get to that population to make them aware. But Rob, I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Kayla. Next slide, please. Martin outlined some of the early benefits that are being identified through some of the compliance activity from the director ID work that we're doing right now. This particular slide just highlights a couple of instances very, very similar to the Matthew Rickson case that was presented earlier in this slide pack, where people have been individuals' identities have been used either without their consent or in a way that is deemed illegal as directors of companies. And in both of these instances, these have been drawn out as a direct result of the ABRS making inquiries of that particular individual who we've identified through ASIC lodgements as being appointed as a director by someone, by an individual. Both of these matters are ongoing, and certainly we'll be certainly looking to publish some of the results and outcomes of some of these cases as more of them come to light. Anyone who interacts with the ASIC Companies Register now knows and understands that much of the unvalidated information that is provided by companies is very open to those who wish to participate in illegal behaviour. And certainly some of these early benefits that we're seeing out of the introduction of Director ID are helping get in the way of that illegal activity being undertaken. Thanks, Kayla. This is just a little snapshot on our progress, our onboarding progress to date. So the Director ID service was made available back in November last year. And in that time, or since that time, we've successfully issued more than 1 million director identification numbers. As I mentioned earlier, more than 88% of those director IDs have been issued through the ABRS online service. There are, of course, non-digital channels for those who are unable to apply for their director ID online. Specifically for Australian residents, we do offer other services for those who don't have a smart device, for example, who have poor internet, who are not tech savvy, who may not even have the appropriate identification documents to get a MyGov ID. We're certainly encouraging those who are in that position to contact the ABRS. It is quite possible that if they do have sufficient information available and that we are able to connect them to an ATO record, that we can issue those individuals with a director ID over the phone. And that is certainly a far better experience and a far better outcome than having that applicant apply for their director ID in paper, which is also something that is available to them. For Australian residents, though, they will need to contact the ABRS in the first instance so that we can then make the determination as to the best course of action for that particular applicant. In some cases, we are unable to issue a director ID over the phone, and we will send that applicant a paper form with some instructions to go about completing their director ID application. In regard to our onboarding, we estimate that there's around 2.5 million directors that we need onboarded by the 30th of November. We've got a significant challenge ahead of us, and we certainly appreciate the work that the agents and intermediaries have done to date, and we are very appreciative of their ongoing support in helping us share those key messages and create a sense of urgency around the 30th of November, given that it is just over a month away. So I think that pretty much brings us to the end of our presentation this afternoon. Some of the key messages here are around the individual needing to apply for their director ID themselves. It can't be a task, or it isn't a task that can be given to a third party for someone to apply on behalf of another person. Directors need to apply by the 30th of November 2022. And there are clearly some important things that we'll be doing to help escalate and bring forward that sense of urgency. Stephen, I'm happy to open it up to questions now.
Yes, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Martin and Kayla. Look, I might just start with a question which came up the other day, and that is, what happens if a director's actually passed away since the legislation came into effect? And that question was actually raised with us the other day, and I know you do have an answer for that one.
Yeah,
they certainly don't need to apply. Yeah, we want to be very clear. we're only looking for, current directors to apply, not people who've passed away.
Right.
So, and in effect, they can't. And the other bit, I mean, to be really clear, they can't. They can't apply because
it is a little bit difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, they can't apply, and we're not. So this is not about going backwards in time to get directors. It's really, we're looking prospectively about getting directors to come and apply within those arrangements. But we certainly don't want to be that sense of following up anyone who's in those circumstances, or that their loved ones and others.
So with in terms of contacting, because it was interesting, we had this discussion the other day as well, and it didn't take me very long. I think it took me about 10 minutes to get my director ID. I got it all online. It was pretty straightforward. But my wife and I were looking at something the other day, and it was to do with a super fund. And just as the comment that you made, as a trustee company, she didn't actually realise that she was a director, and I didn't remember that either. And all of a sudden it's, I need to apply for one. She did actually have some trouble applying online, and then rang the number and was able to get assistance, and fairly quickly got that, and also got her email confirmation this morning of her number. What is the number that they need to call?
136250 is the number. But look, we'd encourage agents to share the information that's available on the abrs.gov.au website. The resources that are available on there will generally answer 85–90% of the questions that applicants have about applying for a director ID. There will be nuances, and we certainly are aware that the MyGov ID service is not perfect. There are going to be naming conventions and things like that where people do experience some issues in getting their MyGov ID. And the best way to help resolve that would be then to call 136250 for assistance. Yeah,
and I must say that it wasn't a bad process. It was fairly painless at the end.
That's great to hear.
Yes.
Hey, Steve, one thing that we do want to communicate though is the phone line can become busy, and certainly we've had experience in the lead up to this campaign launch where we had quite lengthy wait queues on that line, and so we have put additional people on there because we're keen to support people to get their director IDs. But as Rob says, that the strong encouragement is that there's a digital service, and if people can use that, and around 88% of people are finding that works for them, we have that encouragement. But we do need a phone line to help those who can't get through.
Another question this is an interesting question for me. Will insolvency practitioners, for instance, have access to the director ID data? Because I suppose we're the ones that generally see the Phoenix activity happening. Interested in your answer on that one.
Yeah, well, if you go back to the original, when the law was passed, the explanatory memorandum specifically mentions the use of director ID data for supporting insolvency practitioners. So that is the end aim of director ID, to make that information available. It goes a bit back to that timing of the rollout of the Modernising Business Registers program, and at the moment through the company's register, we're not able to store the director ID number in there. That won't always be the case. They'll, as Rob has said, there'll be a process whereby we will actually require the director ID number. We work through a process of there's data standards and disclosure frameworks, and we're certainly looking as part of that process when we have a new company's release to make this information available, because I think we certainly see that the role of director ID being more broadly of use than just regulators. Yeah. There's obviously key practitioners out there that need to be able to have access to this data.
I'm sure it will evolve as time goes on. Another question: why can I still register a company appointed director with ASIC without having a director ID?
Yeah, that's a great question that is posed to us quite often. Why weren't those systems altered or changed to incorporate or embed director ID? Those services, and I'm sure that some of your listeners on this webinar would know some of the issues. that they encounter in using the ASIC technology. The platform in which the company's register is on at the moment is more than 30 years old. It isn't the most flexible and adaptable service around. The costs, and really the Modernising Business Registers program is all about moving the company's register and the ASIC registers off that technology because it is approaching its end of life. It really would have been unviable for us to introduce or to capture Director ID as a part of that process. There's certainly nothing in the way right now from a technical standpoint to stop people incorporating companies and appointing office holders through those services without a Director ID. I will say this though, we've heavily engaged with all of the ASIC digital service providers and other commercial providers who consume the ASIC Edge service and the ASIC ECR incorporation service, along with business.gov.au, who offer a company incorporation service through their website. All of those services have, in some way, shape or form, some Director ID messaging embedded in them. It certainly, as I said, it doesn't prevent the transactions from being processed online, but there are warning messages and prompts for those who are using those services to ensure, or to at least ask the question, have their clients or have they, those individuals, got a Director ID?
Yeah, it's this next question is a very interesting one. What if a director may be unfit, recently suffered a stroke? What happens then? This is if the director was in office pre-October 2021. Yeah,
so look, they're an existing director. So under the requirement, they are an eligible officer. And really the guidance that agents would or should be providing to their clients around those, especially who are suffering from long-term medical conditions, should that individual still be a director of the company? If they are, for example, someone suffering with dementia, or in some way, shape or form, have some type of other debilitating illness, which then prevents them from being fit and proper to be a director of a company. Really, alternate arrangements should be made for those individuals insofar as a directorship standpoint is concerned. From a Director ID application perspective, look, the registrar will consider the circumstances of all applicants and will assess each case where there are instances where an applicant can't apply for their own Director ID. And that can be done through the paper form by providing evidence through way of an explanation, etc., that we can then assess from there before we assess and issue a Director ID.
Okay. So the follow-up question from that is, does their LPR take their place? And then I guess the LPR will need an ID.
If they're appointed as a director of that company, so for instance, if Martin is my legal personal representative and he's ceasing me as a director, Martin is appointing himself as a director, Martin will require a Director ID, yes.
Yeah, indeed. And maybe just if any other questions, just ask them now. So we're getting very close to the end of this session. The one further question, what if I need to submit a paper form and don't get my ID before the 30th of November? What happens there?
Yeah, this is a question we're asked quite frequently as well. Look, the requirement is for directors to apply prior to 30th of November. In some cases, it may well take us, and as you could imagine, as we approach the 30th of November 2022, we certainly do expect an influx of paper, which will create a backlog of Director IDs that we're going to need to get through. As long as the ADRS has received their application for a Director ID, we would accept that they are complying with their obligation to apply for a Director ID. That being said, it may well take us quite some time to manage our way through those applications. Our existing paper form, for example, reflects that it may well take up to 56 business days or thereabouts for the ABRS to provide a response to that application in preparedness of what is expected to be a large volume of paper applications at some stage.
Yeah, well, I think that given, I think you said 2.5 million directors out there, and you've got about 1 million that have registered to date, you've got a fair amount of work that is going to be done in the next month in a perfect world, I think. So, you know, good luck with all that. If there's no further questions, look, I'd just like to thank Rob, yourself, Martin and Kayla, who's done all the work behind the scenes, for spending some time with us today to explain the Director ID system and how it applies. Obviously, I can only encourage all of our network participants to encourage their directors to get in pretty early if they can, to make sure that they comply. So again, thanks guys for spending the time with us today. Our next Red and the Black in a few weeks' time is our last one for the year, and we're going to finish off with Warren Hogan, who is an economic advisor to Judo Bank, talking to us about what's going on in the economy and what we can expect next year. So we welcome you to join us for that particular session. And thank you for joining us today. Thanks again, guys, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks again for the opportunity, Stephen. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen.
Bye.